The race to the moon in the 1960s was part of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. But beyond politics, what kind of imaginations motivated the efforts to go into space and to the moon? Cutting edge science that often thrives on dissent. How does it progress in an authoritarian system? Can we draw any lessons from the Soviet space program with the program today led by China? In this episode of Chai on the Moon, we have a conversation with historian Professor Asif Siddiqi, who is a leading expert on the history of Soviet space program. Hello, please welcome to Chai on the Moon, where we talk about societal and ethical issues related to human settlements in space and in particular on the moon. Our guest today is Professor Asif Siddiqui. It is my honor and pleasure to have a conversation with him. Dr. Siddiqui is a professor at Fordham University in New York. So it's as cold as it is here in Massachusetts, where he teaches history of science and technology. He's considered as the leading historian of the Soviet space program, and his book, Challenge to Apollo, the Soviet Union and the Space Race 1945 to 1974, is considered one of the best on the Soviet space program. We will be talking more about this, but I should mention that he has wide ranging research interests that includes his forthcoming book on Stalinist gulags. And he also has an edited volume on music titled One Track Mind, Capitalism, Technology, and the Art of the Pop Song. And he has an essay on, I think, MIA's track on that. So we may not get on to that unless it becomes relevant. And he also has a forthcoming book on global space history, especially focusing on South Asia and Africa. So welcome, Professor Siddiqui.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
So I will start with as the time goes, and so people will recognize when we are talking. I know you are a historian, but and historians sometimes sort of like get a little upset about if we bring up sort of like the really current stuff. But I know you have wide ranging interests, so I've felt sort of like freedom to ask you this question. But just the recent inauguration of President Trump, this is what he said. One of the things, and his the quote is, "The United States will once again consider itself a growing nation, one that increases our wealth, expands our territory, builds our cities, raises our expectations, and carries our flag into new and beautiful horizons. And we will pursue our manifest destiny into the stars, launching American astronauts to plant the stars and stripes on the planet Mars." Now, I'm just curious, you have worked on Soviet space program, Cold War, global space history. When you hear these words, what do you see? What is in those words? How do you contextualize it?
Well, one is obviously the language, of manifest destiny, which has long historical roots and particular type of resonance. Manifest destiny was really about going back to the 18th, 19th century and uh, sort of this notion that Americans should expand and conquer and into so-called uninhabited spaces. So it does evoke a kind of, to me at least, a kind of callback to the old days of expansion and perhaps even colonial thought. But more to the point about expansion of America, let's say planting the flag on Mars. This is not a new thing in terms of presidents. Presidents all the way back from you can track all the way back to Nixon, really. thinking about Americans going to Mars. Um, the question is, will it happen, and what does it mean, and all this other stuff. All I can say was, given the historical um, record that so many presidents and administrations have sought to go to Mars, to me, it doesn't seem entirely likely that this will happen under the new president. And there's a number of reasons I can get into why I think so. But it does play well in terms of rhetoric. It's got this very sort of high-minded uh, American rhetoric, and I think that manifest destiny and all this taps into uh, uh, probably a minority, but I don't know, of Americans who dream of this kind of revival of that feeling of perhaps expansion and going out into the West. Frederick Jackson Turner, who was a historian in the 19th century, talked about this kind of notion of moving out into the frontier and the westward movement. Of course, we now know, or we need to account for the fact that that kind of westward expansion came at a great cost to the native population of North America. But I think, yeah, I would just say that this is both unsettling in a way, and the way Trump talks about it, but also I'm not sure how realistic it is. And we can get into why Mars is not an easy destination
Yeah. I mean,
for
I'm
them.
just curious. I mean, you mentioned Turner and sort of like the expansion into the West, the idea of the frontier,
Yes,
and
yes,
which also played a role as space as the frontier, or space as the
absolutely,
final
yeah,
frontier. And President Kennedy evoked a similar
yeah.
kind of language. I'm just curious. I mean, is this something today, evoking manifest destiny or that type of thing? Does it have any resonance for space in the same way as it was at that time, because the frontier in some
Right,
ways had been closed, or sort of like,
right,
or explored by the
right,
time the
right.
space race came in? But today we are not in the same situation.
Yeah, that's a good question. My sense is that, well, it holds resonance. The question is for whom, and I think we live in a very different world, let's say, even than President Kennedy in the early '60s. One, because our most people are aware that and because of climate change, our planet is facing some deep-rooted problems. And I think there are many people who would wish that we address those problems first before we try to do something else. So, in terms of the frontier and the frontier thesis and trying to move outwards, I'm not certain that it resonates with a lot of people because there are other problems at home. But I do think it does resonate with some people because, again, the myth of the frontier is a very powerful myth. It's the mythology that this hardworking, can-do, rugged explorer archetype, which is what the NASA 1960s astronauts were, right? They represented a kind of manifestation of that. I think that vision still holds sway over some part of the population, and certainly with the president and maybe people who surround him, including Mr. Musk. So I do think that, but I don't know if that's the right model anymore, because I think for a number of reasons the U.S. is not the only game in town, but also because I'm not sure and I'm not certain that that frontier mythology uh, really serves any kind of even practical purpose anymore. So I think that's also part of it. So it's a different time. It's the use of an old image in a very different time. The fit isn't perfect to me. So I think, yeah.
That's really interesting. Now, you have written about Russian imaginary as well,
Mhm.
and how, and I was surprised about sort of like, how deep it went historically. Like Sputnik, yes, and like, it wasn't just a recent one. Can you say a little bit more in terms of? I mean, again, we are talking about the frontier manifest destiny
Right,
and the
right,
frontier
right.
imagination. What was the Soviet, or the Soviet, and before that Russian
Yeah.
imaginary?
That's a really good question. I think, yeah, people are often surprised to know that there's a very similar form of mythology operating in Russia, and that goes back as long to the 19th century, even, and a kind of a version of manifest destiny, which is it's a different. The details are different, but it's more mystical, more almost occult like, which is the notion of cosmism, which some of your listeners might have read about. This notion that the humans need to explore the vastness of outer space as a way to, to find immortality, really, because we can live forever and so forth. And that's a kind of a simplified version of it, but the basic idea was that Russians in particular have this destiny to do this. And there's other aspects of it, but the commitment to outer space is deeply rooted in Russian culture. It's not something that just happened because of the Cold War. When Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin and all these things happened in the 50s and 60s, most Soviet citizens were perfectly, it seemed perfectly natural that they were the first. It's not like, oh, somebody else. So I think, and it still remains to this day, there's vibrant subcultures in Russia that dream about space, talk about space. Of course, their space program is kind of eviscerated and a shell of what it used to be, but the aspiration remains, which is interesting to me.
So how? So I mean, what were the origins? I mean, is it coming from um, literature, or I mean, or
Yeah,
is it sort of like coming from what was driving that? Again,
right.
I can see them.
Yeah,
Frontier mythology is
yeah, yeah,
because of the U.S.
yeah.
expansion in there. What was driving the
Yeah, that's
cosmism?
no, that's also true because in Russia, the frontier, the physicality of the frontier, which is also huge, Russia didn't really play so much of a role in it. The vastness of Russian space, which is many more times bigger than the United States. There's a couple of sources. One is, as I said, Cosmism comes from a number of philosophers who were articulating this notion in the 19th century, including Fyodorov, but also Tsiolkovsky, and there's a whole bunch of these characters. But the other is that I do think it's underestimated when the communists, the Bolsheviks, came to power in 1917. They brought with them a kind of a deep commitment to science and technology. They completely tried to remake the Soviet Union into this um, uh, modern industrial country. But in the 1920s, there was an explosion of interest in space. So there were science fiction books, movies, theater, artwork, exhibitions. It was unlike any other place in the world, really. And I think that comes from this multiple sources: the philosophy of cosmism, the Bolshevik commitment to, whatever is out there, we'll be at the forefront of it, and really, really talented individuals who are now lost, forgotten to time, who activated and participated in this experiment to think about space. Space was going to be the next sort of frontier of socialism and these kinds of things. So I think a lot of it sort of percolated at the time, and to an extent that it's hard to even imagine, because space was a kind of utopia, and Russians were, many Russians were very utopian and obsessed with this notion of this ultimate utopia. Communism itself was a kind of utopia. So those kinds of discourses were very much activated at the time, and I think that it has remained in some form or other in modern Russia today.
I'm curious about sort of like the spiritual dimension of it,
Yeah,
because you mentioned sort of like there is this beyond. I mean, like and then you have a very hardcore science
yeah,
and
yeah,
technology
yeah,
stuff. I mean, was there a division in there? Was there a tension associated with that, and
yeah.
how did it evolve?
Right, right. Yeah, I tried to work through this in some of my writing. How do you reconcile a very mystical, spiritual dimension? And oh, because one of the aspects of this philosophy of cosmism is that when you die, the particles of your soul, so to speak, go into outer space, and then we can reconstitute them, reassemble them, we can live forever, which is a kind of transhumanist thought, much like today. But the other part of it is that the very whole, cold, hard, you sort of view of science and technology. We're going to make rockets with, storable propellants and all sorts of things that are going on in the 1920s. How do you reconcile? Well, I think what I think of it, I don't think people at the time necessarily separated these two.
Right.
They were just all part of this one big um, epistemology, one big source of thinking. They all fed each other. Nowadays, I think we have much clear divisions between these things. Oh, that's pseudoscience or business. But at the time, even up to the 1920s, I mean, people were just like, it was all part of one big experiment of seeking knowledge. And all of it sort of coexisted as one. So you could imagine both being kind of spiritually minded and also being an engineer and those kinds of things. I think so that's sort of interesting to me, the way people accommodated both worlds.
I'm really curious. This is something that I mean, what you just mentioned, because a lot of the um, sort of like the tech people
Yeah,
today, the billionaires, a lot of them also are interested in sort of like longevity. And there is, I mean, they're pouring money into that as
yeah.
well. And they're also interested in space. So, I mean, like, those two things are coming in. Do you see any lineage to Cosmism, or this is sort of like, more completely independent within the American
Yeah.
context?
The way I would put it, I see definite echoes, right? This is not out of the blue for sure. And some people actively even talk about cosmism. No, the tech people in Silicon Valley who are talking about transhumanism or extending life or making colonies in outer space and so forth, definitely are drawing on some of the same language. But I do think there's some key differences. One is, of course, that the tech people have affirmed, you know, they're they're capitalists, to put it more bluntly, and so they have a different kind of motive. They're so and but also I think they're what I would call sort of quasi libertarian minded.
Oh,
They're really sort of um, they're they're in it for themselves. They're not doing this because for the better of humanity or anything like that. So I think there's some key differences, and I think um, that, but definitely they're drawing from the same pool of quasi, sort of spiritual, metaphysical ideas, and um, so. But I do think there are also fundamental differences that make these current tech people, you know, of a different line. As I said, there is the marriage between capitalism, libertarianism, and extreme wealth is a different phenomena. We haven't seen this particular thing before. So
uh, well, so on that, I mean, I'll just jump on to use this opportunity to talk a little bit about China. I
yeah,
mean, of course, there are parallels from the communist perspective, and their space program itself is going on. So, if we think in the same context first, do you see a Chinese imaginary
yeah,
regarding that, and how does it play a role in it?
yeah. I'm not necessarily an expert in Chinese culture, but it seems to me just by looking at it, there obviously is a vibrant Chinese. Because in order to have an imaginary, let's say in any nation, a national context, it's not just about having scientists and engineers. You have to have a deep rich civil society. You have to have people writing and thinking and producing all sorts of culture, right? And which China does. But in order to, and a long lineage of that, obviously, millennia really. So in order to do that, but there has to be, I think with China, the issue is, China has what I would call, and India to some degree might have it too, which is that they have this sort of access to civilizational history, which is that, well, we were one of the great civilizations in antiquity, and that and going into the Middle Ages, I think that because China was at the forefront of so many different scientific and technical innovations for the longest time, right? And so I think that notion of Chinese advancement still um, inspires people to this day, in the sense that there's a kind of access. We were once the sort of we from everything from paper to irrigation to smokeless powder and all these other things, money, So these kinds of things that I think are very percolating at a very basic level in terms of the civilizational greatness is a source of inspiration for modern China. That said, I do think that China is also, unbeknownst to I think most people here in the West, has a very vibrant, a science fiction culture. They have a very large movie industry, and we don't really we're not aware of it, but some of the most watched movies in the world are Chinese science fiction movies, and Chinese science fiction about Mars, especially, has been extremely popular in the last 10, 15 years. Huge, massive blockbuster novels. And I think you can't discount the fact that there's also a kind of, deep interest in space in China. Again, I'm not a necessarily expert in Chinese culture, but the interest in science in China is deep rooted, and again goes back millennia. The notion of science as a noble pursuit and all this other stuff. So I think all of it is percolating. I think.
I had a chance to visit Shanghai Planetarium recently, and first of all, it was incredible. But they did have, so they had, I mean, almost sort of like narrative of astronomy and space,
Mhm.
and it was interesting to see. I mean, they do give NASA a lot of coverage, but of
Sure,
course,
sure.
then it's their own program as well. But they had a separate wing about Chinese history
Yes.
of astronomy
Right,
and
right.
space. And to me, it was just, I mean, it was, to me, again, it goes back to this thing that they were trying to figure out how to present a larger narrative with this
Yeah.
specific space development.
Right.
Uh, and I also know, which I haven't visited, that was in a different part of the country, but there is a new science fiction museum,
Oh, I didn't
and
know that.
designed by the same architect, Haddad architects, that did
Right.
the Shanghai Planetarium. So it's supposed to be amazing. It started 2 years ago, and so anyway, so there is a
That's
particular science
fantastic.
fiction museum
Yeah.
in
No.
there, and that expresses
Yeah.
the interest.
Yeah. Yeah. No. Science fiction is huge. And I was doing some research on it recently, but there are people who write about it. Science fiction, modern Chinese science fiction emerged in the 50s, but it's become quite big now, and there's a huge market for it because for the longest time there would be translations of Western authors, but now there's homegrown lots and lots and lots of science fiction. So, and yeah, and the history is interesting too. I'll just add that China, prides itself for having launched the first rocket, which is the like a solid powder rocket back in, I don't know, maybe 1,000 years ago. And that history is also important and is used often whenever China launches something. They go, oh, we were the first to launch the to have a rocket. That story is important too.
And of course, the names of space station and the moon
Yeah,
missions
yeah,
and things like that, they are also related to their own
right, right,
mythology.
yeah.
So, and also, when you were mentioning the science fiction, probably it would be remiss to mention the three body problem, which did become an
Indeed,
international
yeah, yeah.
bestseller
That's a good
coming
point. Yeah,
out of China, and I think state supported the project itself.
yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, I think you're right. You're right. Yeah. I mean, this is the other problem with with China is that the play between the state and the capitalist sort of uh, world. So yeah,
So actually, this is a perfect entry point because I'm wondering. I mean, I always think about China. Of course, is technologically and scientifically, it's at the cutting edge, competing
mm,
at the top level, and so was Soviet Union
yeah,
at its height. And there is, as a scientist myself, I mean, like there is this interesting issue that comes in, which I know that you are interested in as well. That how does cutting edge science works in an authoritarian system? I mean, so
yes,
you
yes,
have,
yes,
I mean, science by its very nature,
yeah,
again, in an ideal world. I mean,
sure,
obviously,
sure,
science is, I'm
sure,
generalizing it, but in an ideal world, dissent is a really key component of science, and so
absolutely, yeah,
is challenging authority.
yes, yeah,
That's inbuilt in there.
yeah,
So how does that? How did that work in the Soviet Union? I mean, what was the interplay between that?
yeah. That's a very difficult question, and many historians have sought to try to explore that question, the role of science in authoritarian societies, because we assume, somewhat rightly so, that science requires the free exchange of information, the right to descent, as you mentioned, and so forth. And there's many examples in history, of course, with science butting heads with authority. In the Soviet Union, science was subordinated fully to the state, and so the shape of Soviet science took on a certain kind of um, aura and organizational features, which were very much state controlled. But I do think because of the Soviet successes in certain kinds of sciences like space, nuclear, and so forth, that it's it maybe subverts our notion that science requires the free exchange of information, because I think
Hmm.
it complicates. The Soviets were able to, for everything we can say about all sorts of problems in Soviet science, they were able to accomplish an enormous amount in the system they had. So the question becomes often, did they accomplish, these scientists, in spite of the system? They were the first in space and so forth, or because of the system, which is a very different kind of question. So I think it's somewhere in between. I don't think it's in spite of entirely. I think there is some features of the system that actually benefited science. And I'll give you one example, which is that the Soviet Union in the 50s and 60s trained the largest number of engineers in the world, and including women. So if you see, it's amazing to me. Like this is something I'm beginning to study, the people who designed the Soviet spaceships, like the Soyuz and so forth. So many of them were women too, and this is very different from the United States, where I think even around 1970, about 1% of the engineers at NASA were women. So I think these kinds of things are very different. They operated in the Soviet Union, and I think that so the proliferation of engineers and scientists was very huge in the Soviet Union, and that helped their ability to focus their energies on a vast amount of problems. Of course, they weren't necessarily the best at all of that, but I think they certainly have, by the end of the Soviet Union, an incredibly large apparatus for basic and applied sciences, unlike any others in the world, exploring every different areas of science. It all sort of collapsed, I think. So I think there are, as I said, the answer lies somewhere between, in spite of the system and because of the system they were. But yeah, I think China, of course, and we can talk about it, presents a similar but also different set of questions about science.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting that you brought up the woman participation in it,
Yeah.
because I mean, they launched the first woman in space
Yes.
way
Yes. Yeah.
back,
Yes.
and but that in itself was part of the Cold War
Yes.
politics, because they
Right.
said,
Right.
"Hey, look, I mean, America is like,
Yeah. Right.
they don't give equal rights to a
Right.
certain
Right. Right.
degree," and the woman, I mean, like, they said, well, they cannot go to space, and the space suits. I mean,
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
problems have existed even more recently.
Yes.
So I
Yeah.
think that plays into this broader rhetoric, which was
Yeah.
true.
It's true. It's true. Yeah. I mean, the Cold War is basically a war of propaganda and
Wow.
image making, right? So, but the reality is that both sides were well. It's interesting that the Soviet Union did have a lot of women engineers, and it's interesting that that part was never really advertised. And what they did was, people only cared about astronauts and cosmonauts. So I think it's ironic that the real of course, there was a glass ceiling, and the entire launch of the first woman in space was a propaganda event. They never sought to do so again. Uh, and in the United States, of course, the first women start flying in 1983 with Sally Ride, which is a long time later. And even then, it was a very slow trickle. Now I think there's a kind of, we might say, equity, uh, but still it's quite dominated by men, I think, still, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, if we can continue the conversation regarding, and I know with the acknowledgement that you're not a China expert,
Sure.
but I'm just curious. Do you see um, like Chinese work in physics or astronomy or space and everything? It's at the high level AI and everything. And how do you see that? I mean, what are the parallels? I mean, do you see it with the Soviet system? Is it that the state allows certain exchange of ideas? And again, I would go back to the same thing, like, like, especially not from the applied sciences, but certainly for pure sciences,
Yeah.
that do they give a directive that, okay, well, here is an area where, yeah, I mean, within it there is exchange of ideas, there
Right, right,
is
right,
freedom of
right,
thing, unless it uh, breaks the sort of like, barrier of sensitivity to the government. But I mean, I can
right, right,
imagine
right,
that type
right.
of system can work if somebody is working on, say, for example, galaxy formation,
Sure,
right? And
sure,
like,
sure,
okay,
sure.
well, go crazy with that.
Yeah,
Okay, but
yes.
as long as, like, sort of like, so I mean, is that how it works? I mean, I'm just trying to
Yeah,
figure
yeah.
that out. How?
I think your characterization is not wrong. I think the state is the most powerful force in China, and but it's not the only force, but it is the most powerful. And I think the state probably has some regular, standard sort of operating guidelines. But with basic sciences, I think ironically, I think they probably have more leeway than the applied
Yeah.
guys. Or I think there's something more esoteric about basic sciences that's not going to be legible to an administrator, and they're just going to go for it, whatever. And I think the way if I understand, China funds a vast amount of resources into mostly applied sciences, but also basic sciences, and you probably would know better about that. But it seems to me that their productivity, not just in terms of number of articles published, but I think the quality of it and what they're doing is at the top level now. And I think people always discount that. I think for the longest time, uh, this was probably, there was the perception that China is essentially copying whatever had been done elsewhere. But I've been hearing this for like 30, 40 years. And how much longer can we say the same argument? After a while, you have to give them some credence. Like, actually, they're doing enormous. And, if and even like, some of the astronomy work that I sometimes see in terms of using satellites and so forth is so just at the cutting edge from my layperson's perspective. I'm trying to imagine how this can be a copy of anything. And so I think, I do think that they're now beginning to, if and probably for a while have begun to like carve out their own spaces, no pun intended, for different kinds of sciences, and including sciences that are, um, you know, sort of maybe hot right now, like AI. But one thing I will say is that, you know, we often talk about the politicization of science, but that also happens here too in the West more broadly. I mean, all science is politics at some level, by which I mean that the priorities of what we study are determined at the level of politics, because we study X and not Y because maybe the X is more important to us culturally or some other reason. We're not going to throw things at extremely esoteric problems that no one sees any interest in, and that itself is a political decision. So funding is always politics, and that's what any historians of science will tell you. But even, other historians will claim even the way we do science, the way we organize our results, et cetera, is also deeply politicized and can often be the result of all sorts of biases built into our scientific community. So that happens here too, and so I think, it happens in probably a different way there. One last thing I'll say about China is that, and it's a comparison with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was, highly doctrinaire, by which I mean that when astronomers or scientists produce things, they were often asked to, everybody had to pay lip service to Lenin and all this. There was like a whole script you had to follow, even publishing an article. And so I think China doesn't. I feel like the hand of the government is lighter in that sense. The ideological sort of conditioning that they have to go through. I don't see scientists, and occasionally when I've seen Chinese scientists at international conferences, I don't see them standing up and saying something about Mao or something. They're there to share their papers. So I think in that way they're a bit different culturally. Also, they bring a different kind of energy. So
That is really interesting. Uh, but can I ask you a little bit more, because of your interest in this gulags as well?
yeah,
I mean, many of the, or some, I may be wrong, like, of the people that were involved in the space program
yes,
also showed up in the gulags.
yes.
What, I mean, what were the reasons for them being there? I mean, it wasn't because of their science or challenging authority from the science perspective that they ended up in gulag. So what were the?
Yeah, yeah. This is. It's a good question. I mean, and it's not an easy question to answer. In the 1930s, in the late 1930s, a whole generation of Soviet uh, intellectuals were basically thrown into prison. Many were shot because of the what's called the Great Purges under Stalin. And it's at that time that a lot of scientists, basically, the idea was that if you think about it this way, if you have an authoritarian state and you need scientists to do, but you need scientists to develop the industry and this economy and so forth. But the scientists are smart, so you can't really trust them because they're the one most likely to go against you, right? So it's a conundrum. You need them, but you can't really trust them. So one solution to that problem, a ridiculous one, but one solution is that you can throw them in prison and have them do their science, right? So that's kind of what they did. And so a lot of these guys, they were mostly men like Korolev and so forth, they ended up in a gulag with, they were very well serviced with all sorts of things they needed. And then you just kind of work and do your project and whatever it is. And the projects would be state mandated, but they would be essentially in prison and would have labs and whatnot. So that was one solution to the problem. But eventually they realized that that was inefficient. You just can't do anything. I mean, you can do some limited amount of work for sure, but eventually you brush up against all sorts of constraints because your team needs to talk to another team outside and so forth. And because as they discovered when you're designing an intercontinental ballistic missile, it's not one little team. You have to cooperate with contractors, like hundreds of them across the country, to build gyroscopes or whatever electricals. So at that point, a prison becomes completely, you can't do it. And so you have to have teams talking to each other. And so by the 50s, they dismantled all that stuff. So yeah, there was a moment when that seemed like the ideal solution to the problem of how do you trust these guys, right? Because scientists are smart, they might be up to something. The other problem is, of course, that the scientists might be uh, not telling you the entire truth about their science. And as a manager on top, you don't have the expertise to determine whether the scientist is lying to you or not. So that becomes another level of problem. So you can't really, so you have to eventually trust the scientists. So, yeah.
That is so interesting. So, I mean, again, it does sidetrack, but I'm just fascinated by, and because you are studying, your next
Yeah.
book is about the
Yeah. Yes.
gulags. I
Yeah.
mean, again, my image would be like sort of like, probably stereotypical, coming from some movies or from
Yeah.
some novels or something like that, like, that it's a terrible tundra, in the tundra,
Yeah.
Siberia, somewhere where it's hard labor going
Yeah.
on. But were these scientists like Korolev,
Yeah.
were they in a better gulag? Sort of like,
Yes. Yes. It sounds like a contradiction in terms of better
yeah.
gulag, but yes, that's why if you happen to be in the tundra in Siberia cutting down trees, and if you were a scientist, the first thing you did was tell the camp commander that I have a degree in physics because that might get you out of there and back to the prison where Korolev was, right? So there was a kind of aspiration to get to those science prisons all the time. And so even now, in my book, I talk about stories where people who had no science background would pretend to have science background because to get out of there. So and geology was a really important science, for example, because they were really interested in finding natural resources and mining and all this stuff. So people would in these camps in Siberia would get up to speed quickly on geology and try to impress the camp commander that I can serve the gulag better if you take me out of here. And so yeah, there were all sorts of strategies to get out. But yeah, it was a terrible system. But I think uh, that was the one that they sort of landed upon, and it's dismantled in 1953. And at that point, there's a different model that takes over. Yeah, but yeah, these guys, Korolev, as you know, Sergei Korolev is the leader, chief designer of the Soviet space program. Immense suffering, and I think that that kind of suffering maybe also hardened him to all sorts of battles with the bureaucrats in the 60s. But I think there was a generation of scientists who went through that, and they kind of shared that as a rite of passage, that we all suffered and now we're going to work for our country. That was a motivator for them.
Hmm. I just cannot remove the sort of like, this irony of the fact that there is a class system in Soviet Union in the prison, in the gulag.
Yes. Yeah.
There is, right, on the one hand, yeah. uh, so let's, towards the end, I want to shift the gears a little about global science,
Yes,
and you have been working on thinking what was going on, sort of like, other countries that participated on the outskirts of the Cold War in
right, right,
terms of space,
right.
and today as well. So, what do you find for places like India or in countries in Africa?
Yeah, it's nowadays we talk about sort of the globalization of space in countries like India and China and lots of other countries really. But I've been investigating a little bit back in the Cold War that a lot of the tracking stations that the superpowers were tracking their astronauts and cosmonauts and were positioned in places like Africa and India. So that's one story that I'm following. Like, what happened to these tracking stations? Because they were really all over. And I'm finding the stories are really interesting because they came into conflict with lots of local people who didn't want these stations in their countries, etc. But the other thing I'm also interested in is other countries did try to start space programs in the 1960s, including India and countries like, uh, even Egypt and Pakistan and so forth. They, and I'm interested in the struggle to do that at the time that perhaps wasn't entirely successful because the creation of these sort of side space programs is an interesting story that hasn't really been told in terms of how, as new post-colonial countries were becoming independent, they also tried to sort of participate in this. One way to participate in it, and this is true for many African countries, was to allow NASA to have stations in their country. So Kenya or Nigeria or South Africa and these kind of countries have lots of giant antennas, and these are big, high-tech infrastructures that were positioned. The governments had to make deals because NASA personnel had to be there. And so I'm interested in these stories because they created a kind of alternative history of space on the ground in places like Africa that you can really tell the whole story of the space race from ground stations in Africa. I think I counted like at least 15 to 20 countries that had enormous infrastructure, and we don't really know. A country like, I don't know, Somalia had infrastructure from the Soviet Union tracking spy satellites. So I think these stories have been lost. So I'm interested in that story.
And I know, like for example, from the Pakistan and India perspective, I mean,
Yeah,
they were participating in, I think, mapping the atmosphere
yeah,
over
yeah,
the Arabian Sea. So that was earlier on, sort of like in the early '60s.
yeah.
With Yeah.
I mean, the Pakistan India story is fascinating. Again, it's been lost or mostly not told, but because we follow the India story quite well, and India has a very established canon of history now. India launched a sounding rocket, like a little um hopping rocket, in 1963 from their state Kerala in South India, and it was a NASA rocket. They basically, NASA gave them the rocket, and Indian engineers launched it. But it turns out that there was a little bit of a race because Pakistan actually did that a year before on off a beach near Karachi, and so again a NASA rocket was, and so there was a big competition, and the goal was to study this particular phenomena that was only apparent, this electrojet phenomena in the upper atmosphere, close to the equator. You can find, and this cosmic rays would hit the atmosphere, and this electrojet would appear. So that was where both scientists like Abdus Salam in Pakistan, Vikram Sarabhai in India, invited NASA engineers over and said, "Look, you can study this phenomenon only here." And so that was the carrot that was hopefully would allow NASA to bring infrastructure in. And India did this very successfully because this place in Kerala became very highly developed because not only NASA but the West Germans, the Soviets, the British, all sorts of Japanese, they put stuff down there. With Pakistan, it was different because I think by the time I think Zulfikar Ali Bhutto comes into power, he says we're not going to do that. We're going to do resources into the bomb. So I think they took a very different path. But it's a classic study of how two countries generally comparable can take entirely different paths, but also how many countries, not just India and Pakistan, were able to leverage their geographical location and say, look, you need a tracking station. We're the only place you can put it. So why don't you come here and we'll sign a deal and you'll give us all this other stuff? And so a lot of countries did that. So I use that as a way to say that geography became an instrument of scientific sort of agency, right? Because where you are becomes important because satellites move in different orbits and so forth. So, yeah. And as I'll just end with one last story, which is about South Africa, which, apartheid country in the 1960s. When the Apollo astronauts were coming back from the moon, they had to have a tracking station on the southern atmosphere. And South Africa was the perfect spot. But South Africa was an apartheid country, and so there were all sorts of difficulties. But NASA said, "Well, for this, we'll we'll look the other way." And South Africa demanded all these things that, for example, they said you can't have black engineers at your station in South Africa, or they can't work together; they have to be in different rooms. And but NASA said, "Sure." So they agreed to all these sort of really terrible things because Apollo was more important. They eventually pulled out the station in the 70s because of many Congress people in the South in America were very upset about this naturally. So, but there's all these accommodations and interesting stories that I think would be cool to follow.
Although in the 60s, Americans would not have, or NASA would not have that much objected to it. They
That's
were like,
true.
yeah, sure. Like, you know.
That's true because Jim Crow was very much the lay
Yeah.
of the land. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
And also from geography, it just reminded me like sort of like, those equatorial countries. This is the resistance from the post-colonial countries, where there was the Bogota Declaration, where
yes,
they,
yeah. That's
because they were in the equator, and they said, well, I mean, if you cannot just have a satellite on top of us,
yeah,
right? Like, that our boundary go up. So it's also about a little bit, however it was, like, a little bit of resistance to uh, that type of
absolutely.
space
Yeah,
domination as
absolutely.
well.
Yeah, because you start to think, we have airspace, right? Because everybody has their legal, but is the space above us also legally ours? And that question gets used a lot, and because all these Western countries were occupying all the spots, geostationary orbit. So a lot of countries in Latin America, especially Brazil, were like, you can't just do that. uh, and so yeah, there was a big controversy in the 70s. Yeah,
So how do you see the future? So this is sort of like, my last two questions are much broader, in the
yeah,
sense, I mean, obviously you've done a lot of work on the Cold War, but as we've been talking about, the today is different. You have China, you have India, you have, of course, Japan and European Union, and you also have smaller places like UAE, United Arab
yes, yeah,
Emirates. They are
right,
also in there, not to mention slew of private corporations
right,
that are
right,
in
right.
there. I'm just curious, how do you see the space race shaping up in the 21st century?
Yeah, you know, I'm not a clairvoyant, but I do think that, I mean, the U.S. is obviously going to be a major player, both NASA and private. Uh, I do think that, in terms of things that are going to happen, I think there's going to be a focus on the moon. It's already, lots of little landers are being. I think they just launched a couple the other day.
True.
These private companies are launching these things constantly. I mean, they're not very successful, but they're kind of they show a level of activity because it's very hard to land on the moon as people are discovering. Um, but either way, so the moon will be one. But I think a lot of what's also happening is that people, I mean, more as more and more, this sort of this, the other is the sort of the microsatellite revolution, which has happened in the last 10 years or so. Every country like has a little microsatellite, or and so I think lots of countries have a presence in space. It's much easier to launch something into space because SpaceX has the Falcons, and it's cheap. You could just pay them a little bit of money and they'll launch your satellite into space. So the barriers to entry into space has been lowered. So I think so one phenomena is that lots of different countries and actors have satellites in orbit doing the modest little things, and you're going to see an increase in that. The other is the moon is going to be a focus for more robust corporate and state actors. There's going to be a slew of corporations, but also, as I said, state, the U.S., the China, the European Space Agency, Japan, India are the key players. And I think, but I do think in all of these, China is really the kind of the one to watch, so to speak. And then further down the road, you can imagine something beyond Mars and so forth. But I think the moon is seems to me in the next 10 years a kind of locus of activity in near Earth space. I I don't want to predict anything, but certainly by 2030, I'm guessing the Chinese astronauts will be on the moon. I don't doubt that. Um, and it's possible there may be, with U.S. astronauts too, but I don't know. U.S. has a very not a good track record for keeping schedules, so we'll see.
I'm just curious. Do you think because of the dominance of private companies,
Yeah,
corporations coming in, Blue Origins or SpaceX and others, whereas in China that is not the case, at least
yeah,
not yet. Uh, do you see? Does that make a difference, or does that, or, or do you think this will turn out to be a way of contrast that China goes with the really a state led space program,
yeah,
drawing a contrast with that because that's a very different
yeah,
profit oriented one? Or
yeah,
do you think China will will modify its program to encourage? It is encouraging a lot of startups, space
yeah,
startups.
yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
do you think overall, which way is it? Do you think it might go? So if
Yeah,
I
no,
can
you raise an interesting question, which is that is overall space exploration moving from the state model to the uh, private model, or I see it more as a public-private partnership. I think that's what's gonna, even in China, because there are, as you say, there are lots of startups with rockets and whatnot. I see China as the public-private partnership where the public part is bigger. The U.S. It's hard to say because NASA is pretty big. It's not like, but it's hard to know what's going to happen now with the new administration. So it really is a moment of great uncertainty. I
yeah.
don't know actually. I'd like to think. I think NASA does amazing work. I hope with JPL and these kinds of places. Uh, but I do think that there's going to be a public-private version of something moving forward. It's clear that it's moving in that direction. Whatever NASA does will be with private corporations, and whatever private corporations do will be with NASA. The latter because private corporations depend enormously on NASA infrastructure. We don't really talk about it that much, but every time they launch a rocket from Florida, it's all NASA infrastructure. It's like the fixed investment was already made by our taxpayer money. They're just launching off it. So we don't see the hidden costs of all of this, which are underwritten by the public. So I think in that sense, yeah, SpaceX, who knows what they're going to do, but I'm not as confident about their abilities than many people are because, as I said, it's not easy to land something on the moon and return something from the moon. It's extremely hard. I was really impressed with the Chinese remote sense. Sorry,
Yeah.
collection of samples. That's an
Yeah.
incredibly complicated mission, hardly given publicity in the U.S. I often ask people; they didn't even know it happened. Um, Incredible. So I think
Even from the far side, like
even
so
from the
that's
far
even
side,
further. Yeah.
never been done, not even by the United States.
Yeah.
And they were able to do it absolutely perfectly. They were amazing. It's an incredibly complicated mission because you have to rendezvous and dock in lunar orbit. It's one thing to do it in Earth orbit. So yeah, and again with the far side of the moon, with loss of communications, you don't know, you can't. So I just think that they're at a very different level. One of my friends says that China pretty much does anything the United States does in space. Maybe it does it at a lesser.
Yeah.
There are a few things China hasn't done, obviously, in deep space exploration. They haven't gone beyond Mars, the outer planets. That's one thing the U.S. has absolutely a fantastic lead in. But everything else, you can just point to something, and they go, well, probably it's done something. Maybe it's a little bit less, but they're working on that. You can name anything, and so this space plane that the DoD launches, the X-37B, which is this mysterious little thing. China has one of those too. It's like you can't really say that. So anyway, so yeah, it's an interesting moment.
Yeah. Well, last thing, I mean, I think I would be remiss if I did not ask you. Have you seen For All Mankind?
I have seen For All Mars.
And what do you
Yes,
think? Because that's like it's like written for
yes.
you in some sense. For people who don't
I
know, that's an
know. Yeah,
alternative history where Soviet Union lands a man on the moon a few months before uh, Apollo
right.
11.
And it's sort
So,
of the history pivots out. So
no,
Soviet Union beats America to the moon, and so what happens? No, it's like catnip for me. But I did watch it. I mean, it's really good entertainment. You have to suspend disbelief quite a bit
no.
because so many things. I think there was no spoilers, but there was a storyline there that North Korea had landed somebody on
Right.
Mars. So that was a bit too much. I was like,
Uh,
that's yeah.
Yeah, that
Anyway,
came out of nowhere, by the
no.
way. Like, that was like, okay, all right. Well, it is the creators of that are the same creators who did the newer Battlestar
Yes,
Galactica.
yeah, very good show. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, but I mean, I also remember in that one, sort of like, they will make sure that a twist always is there, like,
yes,
after every few episodes,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah, yeah,
but I thought that Sergei Korolev,
yeah,
and those alternative histories,
yeah.
I thought that was an interesting element in there, and sort of like, imagining what in an alternative history would be like
I
for
think they did
personality.
very well, and they did their research. And yeah, I think there was even a scene where there was a Korolev-like character in
Yeah.
in one episode. But yeah, I thought, and I'm excited to see what's next. Again, it's a little bit silly at times, but it's good entertainment. And I was secretly hoping that they would call me to ask me for historical advice, but
And
they
they did
didn't.
not. I mean, that's crazy. No, I think yeah. I mean, it's a lot of entertainment. So I mean, like, I mean, I don't think it's one of those shows where it goes like, okay, what if, and
Yeah,
okay, and then you go, and then you have all these various aspects.
and I thought they did a lot of the technology quite well. They were showing all the different uh, aspects of Mars and so far. Yeah, it was really good. I'm not as confident as them as that we're going to be on Mars anytime soon, and but I'm one of the naysayers of that. So there's all sorts of technical reasons. I think Mars is extremely difficult for humans even to even visit, let alone settlement. But yeah, but it's nice to see it. Yeah, it's great.
And for my own interest, like, no, whether we should do that or not, that's a whole other question. I mean, if
That's another
it's a
question because it's
life
so
form or not.
expensive, right?
Oh,
But yeah.
and also
Uh,
ethically, I mean, if there are microbes there or not,
oh,
so that
absolutely. Yeah, what we call forward
right.
contamination or reverse contamination, both are problems, right? In fact, I think the Chinese are working on a sample return from
Right.
Mars as this is also a problem of reverse contamination. I'm actually working on a project about that, about contamination with another colleague, hopefully a book. But it's the problems of that, which is germs and so forth, and or germs. But yeah, Mars is a is a pristine. Well, it's no longer pristine because we have dumped so many different spaceships on there. So, but humans haven't been there. Yes.
Right. Well, Professor Siddiqui, thank you so
Yeah.
much for your time. And I should mention for others, I am going to have link to your website down there, because you have your articles. I love the
Yeah.
fact, like, that are all linked over there. You can again
Yeah.
find it. You can find links to your books as well.
Yes.
And absolutely, it was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so
A
much.
pleasure talking to you, and thank you so much. That was really fun.
Thank you.